and welcome back to the Nature Garden podcast with me, Carl Steinson, and the weekending show team from Lionheart Radio. Come along with us as we take a bonny wee wander down the garden path and country lane with the birds and the bees and the flowers and trees, and it's a chance to hear some great Northumbrian stories. On today's show, autumn's here and Tom Pattinson's got heap lie on in the garden, and he's enjoying the seasonal blooms and foliage. Leaves are falling, and so are feathers. Tom Cadwallender's here to tell us more about the great moult, and he's keeping an eye on urban skies. We're also going back in time on an archaeological dig with Steve Lowe and the Anglo-Saxons. Plus some top tips for the garden from Tom P. All coming up on the Nature Garden podcast.
Take my hand and come with me, darling, down to the shoreline.
The autumn garden truly is a magic place, and Tom Pattinson's revelling in the late blooms and foliage.
It's autumn again in the garden. Every season has its ups and downs, its positives, its negatives, and goodness, autumn has a few negatives. First and foremost, all that lovely lush green growth of summer died down, most of it, not on the evergreens of course, but deciduous plants in the garden, herbaceous perennials, stems finished, need chopping down, etc. Those strong winds, and of course the falling temperature. Everything needs a bit tidying up, all those leaves hanging around. Okay, so let's look at the positives. First and foremost, above all else, everything can be tidied up, chopped down, the browns and the greens remaining from the vegetable garden and from the mixed borders, all of that can go into a composting facility, and that helps enrich the soil through time. So that's not being wasted, any of it. But I look to the colour in the garden. There is always colour if you've been planting a few plants throughout the year with colour in mind throughout the year. My big one is I can see Rebecca Goldstone. It's a beautiful thing, coneflower, with the centre, a cone in the middle, dark brown, almost black, and beautiful yellow flowers surrounding it. That's a big one for me. There's also another lemon queen, helianthemum, very tall. It's probably about 1.5 meters tall, growing with me. It's beautiful at the moment. It keeps on flowering. Another one, a few actually, salvias. Don't underestimate salvias. I have several perennial salvias in the garden. Amistad is a very tall growing one, great long spikes on it, beautiful of bloom. And then there's my favourite actually is Cambridge Blue. It's just grows to about 30 centimetres, but oh, what a vivid view those flowers are, even at the moment. And of course you can save seeds of them. I see the seed pods, 1 or 2 little seed pods have formed. And then getting really small and down to the same 30 centimetres height in the borders. I've got a few along the front, and they're just, each individual flower is just about, a centimetre across, that's all, a centimetre. Amazing. And there's one called Sweet Lips, another called Hot Lips, which is red and white. And it just looks like a pair of lips, the shape of the flower. Things of that nature really cheer me up at the moment. And outside, the cosmos, half-hardy annual, They vary in height. I have them from about 30 centimetres up to, well, almost half a metre. And those, at the moment, they look like tender plants, but they've got gorgeous, multicoloured reds, pinks, whites, beautiful flowers, about probably something like about 5, 6, 7 centimetres across. Beautiful, and they go right up to the frost. They're much hardier than the seam. So they're out there, and the begonia semperflorens, it just won't stop flowering. That's a begonia with, well, semperflorens means continually flowering. It would stop when the frost came because it's got fleshy leaves, and they'd expand in the frost and collapse into mush afterwards. But it's not all done. It's flowering in the border. Fairly soon, before the frost does arrive, I'll be digging some of the plants up, checking the roots to make sure there are no vine weevils in or vine weevil bugs, because they tend to be endemic in that plant. Check those, pot it up, bring it indoors into the garden room where there's moderate warmth. It will start growing again, and it will give me many more flowers over the winter period. I'm looking at the outdoor pelargoniums. If I cut some of those down, they've been used in bedding and in containers. That's commonly called geranium, but pelargoniums they are. And chopping some of those back, bringing them into the garden room, potted up, of course, 1 or 2 of them, and they too will flower again. The fuchsias outside at the moment, I have 3 or 4 different varieties of hardy fuchsias. Oh, they are just gorgeous, tiny flowers, but a mass of them. Got pinks and whites and deep pink, pale pink, and they're really valuable at this time of year. So there's quite a roundup there of things that are cheering me in the autumn garden.
I'm Tom Heap from Countryfile, and you're listening to the Nature Garden podcast.
Birds do some incredible things, and here's one that's completely new to me. Tom Cadwallender from the British Trust for Ornithology's investigating our feathered, or should that be not so feathered friends? Over to you, Tom Cadwallender.
It's great to be back in the nature garden. I've had quite a nice summer off, but it's good to get back into the swing of things and share some of my thoughts and experiences. Well, here we are. We're into October. I always get the feeling that October and the autumn generally is a time of change, a real big kind of swap over, particularly in the birding world, ornithologically speaking, you know. And what I'm thinking of at the minute is kind of change in terms of, you know, birds on migration, but also it's actually how they change their plumage. And after a busy summer period, lots of birds have their feathers are kind of worn out, basically, because they've been kind of busy raising young ones. And there's some interesting strategies around. Think about the small birds, the migratory birds, the things like chiffchaffs and willow warblers, 2 very closely related species. And the chiffchaff will actually wait until it's in the African winter quarters before it changes its plumage. But the willow warbler will actually change its plumage on migration. And so they will start the moult, as it's known, and they will carry on until they get to a kind of a safe place en route, and then they'll suspend that moult until they get to their winter quarters. Then they'll continue it and finish it there. Fascinating strategy. But what I'm thinking of is sometimes the birds of prey have to change their feathers too. And I found a feather in our garden just last week, and I immediately identified it as a sparrowhawk, a female sparrowhawk. And the thing about these kind of birds of prey, and particularly sparrowhawk feathers, is that you can identify the individual because they'll have the same pattern, same markings when they grow their new ones. So, you can identify the individual, which is absolutely fascinating. But those birds of prey, and generally birds will actually molt their feathers in rotation, and they'll drop a feather from each wing. Their flight feathers are quite important, obviously, so they want to retain their flight. So they will drop them one each wing simultaneously, so they're not completely flightless. However, the kind of strange strategy that wildfowl have is that they will drop all their flight feathers at the same time, which is totally bizarre when you think about a flying creature like a bird dropping all of its flight feathers. But that's exactly what they do. And at that time, they are obviously flightless and they are particularly vulnerable. So ducks in particular will have an intermediate plumage where their body feathers, their kind of contour feathers, will change into what is known as eclipse plumage. And eclipse is kind of like a camouflage, because when they're flightless, obviously they're vulnerable, so they need to have some kind of mechanism. And they'll do this on their kind of northerly breeding grounds. I'm thinking in terms of sort of widgeon and teal and pintail and birds that are going to come from the north, from a long way north, to winter with us in Northumberland and in the UK generally. So these birds are now arriving from their northern breeding climes, and they're arriving in this eclipse plumage, which is quite cryptic, and it makes them really quite tricky to identify. And it's always the kind of you're scratching ahead of time thinking, what on earth is this bird, you know? But sometimes you can tell just by the shape of it. But yeah, so they come, they've dropped all their flight feathers on their breeding grounds, or some species actually go to a particular place where they can drop their flight feathers and be very kind of safe there, because it's kind of traditional and they know the problems that are associated. And so they will grow their flight feathers, but they will arrive still in their eclipse plumage. As I've said, it makes life really quite tricky. But all wildfowl go through this. All the duck species and all of the geese species as well have this kind of crazy molt where they will drop all their flight feathers at the same time. Really quite bizarre, but it's a fact, and they survive. But can you imagine becoming flightless? And it kind of makes you think about the kind of the change that some of these birds are going through. And a lot of the waders that we have coming to winter here in the UK, they will be coming from a long way north, and some of them are arriving in their what's remnants of their breeding plumage. So they will molt all of those body feathers, those contour feathers, and they will molt all of those. Sometimes species like black-tailed godwits, for example, they will arrive from Iceland, and they'll be brick red, quite stunningly attractive. But actually, they will molt through the autumn and get into winter, so they'll be quite kind of bland in their plumage, and that's to do with kind of mechanism. But by next spring, they will have adopted their summer plumage again. So back to the wildfowl. I'm thinking about widgeon, actually, because I see a lot of widgeon on my home patch of the Aln Estuary. So they're arriving, and the males are kind of this russet brown colour, which is completely different to the kind of the pinky hues and that they have in their breeding plumage. But anyway, they're arriving like that, and they will go through this autumn, gradually changing to be ready in their most pristine plumage by next spring. So they're ready to head back north again and be in their prime, if you like, for when they get back to their breeding grounds, so they can attract a mate. So that's quite important for them. So they go through this whole molt thing. But there's another crazy sort of situation to feathers. I'm sure you'll have heard of cormorants and shags. These are kind of the dark birds that we see on a coast, and occasionally you will see cormorants around reservoirs. Anyway, these water birds, and they feed on fish. You'll often see them hanging their wings out. They'll be sort of standing there in a kind of a crucifix sort of form, and what they're doing is basically drying out their wings, because their feathers are not waterproof, which is another bizarre thing. Another bizarre bit of evolution when you think about a water bird that has, fishes and so forth, that it's not waterproof. But actually, if it was waterproof, they wouldn't allow them to dive into great depths to catch fish. So the non-waterproof feathers, they can actually be held more closely to their bodies and allow them to dive more deeply, which is a great strategy for me, actually. It's great. So when you see cormorants and shags with their wings open, kind of drying their wings, you know what's going on there. It's not a silly thing. It's actually quite clever, actually. It allows them to dive to great depths. And thinking about birds that dive to great depths, I'm thinking about the auks, the guillemots and razorbills and puffins. Now they're really off. They're not very good on land, but they're fantastic in underwater, and they can swim quite dynamically underwater, which is brilliant. But these birds will actually molt all of their flight feathers at the same time too. So they've got a similar strategy to the wildfowl. But these birds actually winter well out to sea. And puffins will be in the North Atlantic now. And some of those birds will still be flightless. And they're bobbing around in the middle of the North Atlantic, which is absolutely crazy. But that's what they do. And they go through their mould. So when you sort of next look out and think about birds and feathers, because we see lots of feathers floating around, you know that some bird has gone through some moult. And some will actually go on a moult migration. They'll go to their particular place to change their feathers. I'm thinking about shelducks will go down to the Low Countries, for example, and molt there. But yes, when you see the feathers and you see feathers lying around, have a thought about these crazy little kind of mechanisms that birds have to change their feathers. So really, the autumn is a fantastic time of change, time of refreshment. It's wonderful. I really enjoy the autumn. It's fantastic. Great stuff. Good to be back.
Picking fruit is one of the perks of seasonal planting, and this week Tom's checking the ripeness of apples and filling his boots and trugs.
I was mentioning things that I see to be positives about autumn, and certainly picking fruit is. We've done this all summer with the soft fruits. Any surplus has been stored in the freezer to see us through winter, of course, as usual. But particularly at the moment, I've been looking at the pears, and the ideal way for me to store them is I keep feeling them to see if they're soft, any softer and ripening, but it doesn't work that way with pears. They're always hard on the outside at this time of year. Even if I tried probably the middle of November, it would be the same. So I pick them now, put them into a drawer in the house. Some people put them in the garage where it's cooler. I put them in the house.
Can you see me
But
by
that drawer in the
Shagpile,
spare
Jason
room,
Fair?
I have to inspect it every single day because they ripen very quickly on the outside. They've started the process inside the pear, of course. So little feel, little sniff, and oh gosh, that's the way to get them. Don't let them waste on the tree, for goodness sake. But the big crop with me, for the moment for me, is the apples. And I have a sort of the batting order that we have in cricket. I have that for my dessert apples. The Discovery was ready end of August into September, and some of those are stored, but they don't stay much beyond Christmas fresh. So pick those early. You should be picked off the tree now. Give some, if you've got too many, give them to some friends or neighbours, because they won't last much beyond December. Frankly, they go very soft and woody. The one that follows that is James Grieve. It's a beauty, the Scottish apple. It's my favourite tasting apple. It's beautiful, just taken as dessert straight from the tree. And that's followed by Egremont russet. It's a little bit later. They're still on the tree, but I'm sure you all know the way to test whether they are ripe or not. If you don't see them falling to the ground, then of course go and handle one. I approach with my slightly cupped hand, palm facing upwards, hold it gently and just give it a little upward flick and twist, and it'll come away in your hand if it's ripe. That's the apples. There's still others. I have the Howgate Wonder, which is a cooker, of course, type culinary. Lord Derby is still on the tree. It's another cooker. And Bramleys. There are two Bramleys types here in this garden. Bramley seedling, that ancient one from 1813. It was first launched onto the market, believe it or not. But it was, and it's still around, and still arguably the best keeper of cookers around. It's still being used from our store in the garage in March and into April. And the one that followed it, about 100 years later, 1913, was a sport, Scarlet Bramley. It keeps well also. But there's more than apples and pears to the garden at this time of year. I continue picking the autumn fruiting raspberries. Quite amazing, the golden varieties, the autumn bliss, types like that. Buy them especially, slightly different way of pruning those when they've finished flowering, about sometimes into the middle of December, if the weather's favourable, finished fruiting I should say. That's when I just stop everything down to the ground and they've vanished. But come February, sometimes late January, they start shooting again and they're off. Other fruit on these premises, in the greenhouse, quite a large greenhouse, we're picking the grapes. White grape, Madeleine Angevin, and the black grape, so-called Black Hamburg. They're delicious. The big problem is there are one or two wasps getting in through the automatic vents. They're not eating the fruit. They're interested in any aphids that are on the leaves. Having said that, the bigger problem is, if you allow it, is moulds and fungus to start on the bulb, the fruit themselves. The bunches can start to rot. Best way to get round that is to remove some of the leaves and to create an airflow. Flow of air will keep that under control. Those can stay on. I'm not going to pick too many at once. There are lots of bunches still left, but they stay on the vine until we're ready to use them. That way, they remain fresh. In Victorian times, they used to have bottles for them, to put them into bottles, the stalks, the bunches, but we don't need that. We can manage the way it is.
Tom Cadwallender's been swapping the shoreline for the street and checking out the tall buildings and parks for some urban avian surprises.
I'm a real country boy. In fact, as you probably realise, I'm a real coastal boy. I enjoy being by the seaside. I enjoy being in remote areas. I enjoy kind of just that whole kind of idea of being on your own. You know, it's fantastic. And just watching nature just do its thing. It's fantastic. However, I do like being in cities. Not for lots of times, but actually just as a quick fix. I enjoy going to London and just spending time walking the streets. But you know, when you're in these kind of great metropolises, and you should not switch your mind off to wildlife, because there's an awful lot of birds. There are an awful lot of birds who have adapted to living in these kind of urban concrete jungles. I'm thinking, if you go to London, for example, you know, there's birds there which are really quite exotic. You may have heard them, ring-necked parakeets, and these have escaped from captivity, but they've formed a feral population in some of these urban areas, particularly in the south, where we see quite great squads of them. I'm thinking around London, you know, the Kingston upon Thames and that sort of area. So they really have adapted to living in that urban environment. And even to the extent that we have a small population of these ring-necked parakeets in Newcastle, and they are breeding there now. There's a concern that they have they're hole nesting birds, and there's a concern that they're putting off native species like starlings and little owls from nesting in those the hole cavities. But nevertheless, they're here. Ring-necked parakeets are, for me, quite spectacular. They're really quite exotic still. They've got quite long tails. You'll be familiar with parakeets from movies or even in captivity. But they've got long tails and they're green, and they screech as they fly over. And they'll be about the size of a kestrel, actually. So they're quite big, but they're quite something. See them flying around. But there are other species which have kind of recolonise almost, and I'm thinking of peregrines. Peregrine falcon is probably one of the biggest falcons in the world, and falcons are a particular bird of prey, but falcons will stoop on their prey. Peregrines will actually are the fastest recorded bird in their stoop, which is amazing, and they'll fly at something like 200 miles an hour in the stoop down to a bird of prey in the air. But anyway, they have now come back into some of our cities, and they are nesting on the high towers of cathedrals, for example, and people are now putting nest boxes out for them because they need ledges to raise their young, to build a nest. And a number of cities now, I'm away for a few days in Chester, for example, and next door to where I'm staying, in the hotel I'm staying at, there is a big industrial tower, and on that industrial tower there's been a nest box fitted, and peregrines are nesting in there, which is incredible really when you think about it. But you think, what are they going to feed on? What else is there? But there are huge numbers of feral pigeons, of course, and so they are harvesting those, and they're doing very well. And almost all big cities in the UK have got peregrine falcons nesting in the environs. So yes, there's a lot of stuff going on in cities in terms of our wildlife. And I've got a good old pal who goes back a long way, and his great adage, in fact he's known as the urban birder, his adage is look up, keep looking up, because there's all sorts of things flying over. You just never know what you're going to see next. And yes, so keep your eyes open, keep your eyes peeled, just keep looking up and you'll be astounded. See you later, folks. Bye.
And it's a hearty autumnal welcome back to Steve Lowe, who's downing trowels after an amazing dig with volunteers alongside fieldwork archaeologist Jane Harrison, finding out how the Anglo-Saxons lived in Northumberland.
Well, we're here just to the south of Felton on the River Coquet, and I'm joined by
Jane Harrison.
Hi, Jane.
And I'm a fieldwork archaeologist running the excavations near Felton.
Brilliant. And we've got one day to go, and we're on track, which is good.
It's always good.
Yeah.
You don't want to be rushing around like headless chickens in the last 2 days, but we're well on track because we've had the most fantastic group of volunteers. We've had over 60 people over the 4 weeks we've been here. A lot of locals, some people who've never done it before from the village, and some people who've done lots, and some people who've done a little bit. And
some people who've forgotten everything they've done and have had to relearn it again. Hands up.
You're not alone.
Mm.
Yeah, and also some people from Newcastle University, students there, postgrad students, and also some of the volunteers who work on a project that I run down in Oxfordshire. And they've come up to work with volunteers from the local societies and from around here, which is really nice.
It's good, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's been a really nice eclectic mix, and everyone's got on. We've even managed with the portaloos and everything like that.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think when we first came, what we had was a field full of sand. And what we've got is something totally redefined, isn't it? So I don't know how much you want to say about this, because I know there's a lot of work to do yet.
There's an awful lot of work to do. We've done 3 seasons.
Yeah.
The first 2 seasons were just 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And we've done 4 weeks to finish off because we need to stop now and get it published and sorted. But we are definitely on a site that is early Anglo-Saxon into Middle Anglo-Saxon, so 5th to 9th century. And it may have gone on for longer. Mm-hmm. It's difficult to know because it's been ploughed. So it means we've lost quite a lot of the archaeology to ploughing and also to wind erosion.
Of course.
Because, as you said, we're in a sandpit, basically, and half of the field blows away when there's a strong wind.
Yeah. We've had a fair bit of that as well, haven't we?
We've had a fair bit of that, we have, yes. Beautifully exfoliated.
Exactly, yeah.
But what we know now is that this was quite a significant local site. It was somewhere where people were making things and probably exchanging and trading, or making things for some kind of local lord, perhaps as part of their dues and duties and renders, which is the way that sort of society worked, is that in exchange for the lord's protection and for some work, people would be giving things like textiles, objects they'd made, food, so cows and sheep.
We've found a lot of bone, haven't we, on site? Yes.
But what we know is that on this site in particular, they were making cloth.
Oh, right, yeah.
Because we've had in the last year, we found one of the early Anglo-Saxon buildings that are called sunken featured buildings, where they dig down into the soil. It's easy here because it's sand.
Yes.
To get a bit of depth, and then put a sort of tent-like wooden roof over the top. But this one was quite big, and had clearly been used for weaving on upright looms, because it had burnt down, and we found the lines of the loom weights, the clay loom weights that hold the threads of the loom, just dropped where the loom had burnt, along with fragments of the loom. And they're quite big, these loom weights. They're 20 centimetres across, quite chunky, a big donut.
Giant donut.
Yeah, you'd have felt very full. If you'd eaten a donut that size.
Well, you might have done, I wouldn't.
and also 2 different sizes, so for different sorts of cloth. And also we've found in previous seasons evidence for metalworking.
Yeah.
So making both getting iron ore and making things from it. But this season has kind of brought the story together, because what brought us to the site was metal detecting.
Yeah.
We've had the fantastic collaboration with metal detectorists from a Gateshead group, who have reported all their finds, and it came to Jane Kershaw, my colleague's attention, that there were lead gaming pieces and lead weights, coins called stikers, and other little things that are associated with the Viking heathen Great Army, which was rampaging across Northumberland to go up and attack the Picts in the late 9th century.
Right, yeah.
And we have had a few late 9th century dates. So there's some kind of interaction with them going on.
And you get some of that from what's called radiocarbon dating, so you can actually be relatively precise about that. Yeah.
Relative. It's date ranges, but yes, it's scientific dating.
Yeah.
And the nice thing is that we have been able to do that. But this year we've kind of got a much better picture of how the site worked. And we know that there's an area where there are more of those buildings, those dug down, sunken featured buildings, which are kind of like your Anglo-Saxon shed. They'd use them for whatever they needed. They were practical places. And we've found one this year that hadn't burnt down, and we've got another just coming up, which looks like it may have done, and it may have had a nice wooden floor, that one actually. And we've found another area where they're working metal, but really interestingly, where they're actually smelting it. So they're getting the iron ore and working the iron out of it to then purify it and smith it. Actually make, perhaps even casting.
But it's quite exciting to find stuff like that, actually, isn't it? Yeah. And it's definitely a jigsaw.
It is.
I've seen some of the drawings, and
But also we've got a lovely post-built building.
Yes.
So not just one that's dug down with a little wooden tent roof, but one that's got really big wooden posts that are, really big. We're talking 30, 40 centimetres, sunk down into the ground, and then at sort of 3 or 4 metres apart, and then joined with probably a base plate on the ground, and then smaller posts with wattle and daub, or planking, making the rest of the wall. And we've got a beautiful hearth in there, stone one, really burnt. You can see that it's been used to have a fire.
It's really deep red, isn't it?
Yeah, really deep red. Yeah, not as high temperature as the absolutely shattered, bright orange of the smelting tower that we've got, but a different sort of heap. But perhaps where they were cooking, because we found a lot of bone, or even rendering animal fat to add to the heavy textiles, which they did to sort of waterproof them. But definitely some sort of cooking or rendering. And we've also found a few loom weights that suggest that they were possibly weaving in there as well. Just a couple of looms, perhaps not as intensive as in the other place. You can tell where the internal parts of the building are, despite everything having gone, because it's really charcoaly and dirty, effectively.
And just at the minute, if you're standing in that, you can actually imagine it in use as well, can't you? Maybe it's, I'm my imagination running wild, but I can't see how it would work.
I think you have to. I think when you're working on sites like this as an archaeologist, you have to get your feet on the ground and know what exact evidence you have. But you have to think about, okay, how can I bring this to life?
Yes.
And you need your imagination there.
Yes, you do.
It's really important because otherwise it doesn't. You can't bring it to people and say, look, this is really exciting.
Yes.
Because it just looks like a bunch of brown sand.
Yeah, well, it's 50 Shades of Brown,
it's
in
50
fact.
Shades of Brown.
Yeah.
It is, absolutely.
And this shading is important because it does show where one feature stops and another one starts, or where, so that's really good. Well, obviously there's a lot more work to be done because,
there is.
The digging in the ground is only the start of it really, isn't it? So there's what they call post-ex to do.
Yes.
And then a publication.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we've also got the place where we think they're making the loom weights.
Yes.
Which is really exciting because I don't think they've ever really been discovered. So we've got a brilliant hearth where they're baking these loom weights to then use.
And they're still in situ in some cases.
They are.
And local materials as well that seem to be relatively abundant here. And just standing in the what is now a field, you can see a really good vista, so you can see why they've chosen it as well.
Yes, and it's got good, got the river, which would have been navigable. Yeah. Because it'd be a very different river to the river we see today, and also nearby old Roman roads they could be using. So it's a very good, it's well connected. So if you're trying to get what you're making out to either the local lord or to other people, and you're wanting people to come to you, then it's very, and you can see people coming effectively. And we've had nice little finds like round the hearth that we were talking about in the building, little spindle whirls that's used for spinning. So whoever was in there was not only weaving and cooking but spinning
as well.
And other hearths we found have had little spindle whirls round, and little knives, fine iron knives that could be used for cutting thread or for quite delicate work, as well as some bigger, more sort of agricultural things. And there have been some rather fancier finds because we've kept metal detecting, and this field has been metal detected. Yeah, just utterly.
But we're still finding things. That's
still finding
interesting.
Things, yeah, and that's been great. So we're at a stage now where we'll have to stop and send it all out to people who are specialists in loom weights, in the sorts of little finds we've been making, and get more radiocarbon dates, and then pull it back all together to publish it.
And so, to the sound of War Blackbird, here's Tom with some things to be getting on with in the garden.
Okay, it's jobs for the week time, and I've been thinking about the positives that autumn brings. Very soon, we're getting into it now, nature's planting time, and the garden centres will be putting in new stocks of ornamental shrubs and trees. Look at those and think leaf colour, autumn colour and leaves, and think berries for your benefit and for the birds. I've been looking around the garden at the moment. Take a minute to look at these things. Autumn colour. Mine, I see the autumn colour or the change in the leaf colour of deciduous trees and shrubs as nature's firework display, only it lasts longer than any one of the fireworks they show you on that go off on November the 5th. It's a slow process. It's a reabsorption of the goodness, the items of food in the leaf back into the plant, so it's not wasted before the leaves fall to ground. And at the moment, I've got to tell you, it's starting to change already. The beautiful, tall, feathery-leafed Gleditsia is changing colour in the garden, and there's lovely acers as well, of course, they're changing. Cercidifilum is the burnt sugar tree. If you rub the leaves, a handful of the leaves, and you take a sniff in your hand, it just smells like cinder toffee, burnt sugar. A brilliant type of fragrance comes from it. That's a beauty to look at the moment. And of course there's the Coelruteria, which is the golden rain tree. It's changing, but common garden shrubs in the garden, in this garden alone, the viburnum bodnantense dawn. There's a redness coming into the leaves. They'll fall, of course, eventually, and the first flowers have come on, fragrant flowers. Quite amazing. It lasts all the way through winter, and that is cheering me up no end, because I can detect the fragrance in the buds just as they're opening, and it flowers until about April next year, non-stop, unless it's knocked back a wee bit by frost. Then there's the hips, the rose hips. There's some beautiful rose hips, the rugosa type with the large tomato-shaped hips on them. They're gorgeous to look at the moment, and of course the birds love those. And then there's Rosa geranium with the flagon-shaped hips, just like an old-fashioned flagon. Amazing. Rowan berries, pyracantha. Take a look around, you'll find them. Beautiful. Think about adding, if you have room, adding one or two of those to your garden with this upcoming nature's planting time. Warmth remains in the soil, you see, during October, November. Relative warmth. I know the temperature on the surface get rather cool, but in the soil they can remain quite reasonable, enough to encourage early rooting, a new series of roots on the plants you introduce. And that's a really good start for next year. What else have we got in mind at the moment? Well, you can start bulb planting, of course. Bulbs, plant them at the right depth. The depth depends really upon the type of soil you've got. As a general rule, if you look at or measure the height roughly of the bulb from its base to its tip, then you plant generally twice that depth. So the tip of the bulb in the planting hole is twice the height of the bulb below the surface of the soil. So something like the daffodil, narcissus, they can be quite large. Some of them up to about 10 centimeters. So 20 centimeters space on top of them. But that's in a sandy soil. If it's a clay soil, well, not quite as deep, of course. That's the thing about it at the moment. There's good choice out there in the garden centre. I'm looking at the lawn. Keep cutting the lawn as long as you need to. Any repair jobs can start soon. Returfing, breaking broken edges and so on. And of course, most importantly, order those seed catalogues with seeds and plants in for next year. They're free, generally, cost of postage, and there's a range of things you should start planning now for next year. And when you've cut down the herbaceous perennials, if they're big clumps, divide some of them up, and you've got fresh plants from them. A simple way of propagating herbaceous perennials of your choice. Well, whatever you're doing over the next week, enjoy your gardening.
Listening to gardener Tom Pattinson, birder Tom Cadwallender from the British Trust for Ornithology, and Steve Lowe from the Northumberland Rivers Trust. I'm Carl Steinson, and don't forget you can listen back to all the previous reports we've done on the Nature Garden Podcast. That's the Nature Garden Podcast. Enjoy your gardening and time outdoors with nature. Bye for now.